Hello. This is Lecture 4, Responses to the New Society, Religious Reform, Industrial Workers, and Farmers. Before I begin introducing this lecture, I'm going to move down to slide 2, where we have our key terms list. If you want to pause the video at this time, you can copy down your key terms, which I recommend you doing. All right, I'm going to move back up to slide 1 for a second. Okay, let me tell you what this lecture is about. As we've seen in our previous lectures, the post-Civil War period witnessed 4 profound social and economic changes that affected nearly every American in some way or another. These included the rise of big business and industry, immigration, urbanization, and what I've previously termed challenges to faith and confidence. Coupled with these changes, there were also 2 vast regions of the country, the South and the West, that were being transformed in revolutionary ways. The South, by virtue of having lost the Civil War and having seen its fundamental social institution, which was, of course, slavery, destroyed, and having seen its political system completely overhauled by Reconstruction. While at the same time, the West was also being transformed, with indigenous native tribes of the West being driven out, overwhelmed, and ultimately displaced by waves of white American settlers who gradually conquered the region and incorporated it into the United States. So there are major changes going on in America during this period. And the subject of this lecture is basically how Americans attempted to cope with, how Americans attempted to respond to these changes in various ways. The changes going on in American society brought a number of positive things. They brought unprecedented economic growth, lots of new jobs, lots of economic opportunities for millions of Americans, a gradual standard of living, gradual improvement in the standard of living. But all of these changes came with a cost. The new social and economic order created a variety of problems, some of which we've already talked about, which were not always easy for Americans to deal with. These problems included problems with urbanization, crime, corruption. We've talked about the big city political machines that ran most of local government in major American cities, poor sanitation, rampant vice with your red light districts, your brothels, your prostitution, your gambling, etc. There were also problems associated with industrialization. Rapid growth of industry combined with a lack of federal and state regulation led to a variety of inequities for industrial workers. These inequities included a loss of independence. Back when most American workers worked in small workshops or factories that employed at most a few dozen men, your workers tended to be more skilled workers, and they worked with much less oversight, much less direct control by their employers or their supervisors. And of course, if they were farm workers, they would pretty much set their own schedule. They determine when they plant, when they harvest, how long to work in a day. So earlier in the 19th century, most American workers, agricultural and industrial, had a great deal more autonomy, a great deal more control over their day-to-day work lives. But after the Civil War, that began to change. People began to crowd into the cities to go to work in bigger, larger factories, using more machines. There was less of a need for skilled labor because a lot of the work that had been done by skilled workers before could now be done with machines. And as a result, industrial work becomes a lot more dependent. The work of industrial workers becomes a lot more dependent upon the employer, upon the supervisor. Those are the people who set the schedule. They determine when you're going to work, how long you're going to work, under what conditions you're going to work. And so workers lost a great deal of the independence that they'd had before. Coupled with that, a lot of industrial workers in the late 19th century experienced extremely dangerous working conditions. As big business built its industrial plants, big business often paid very scarce attention to worker safety, with the result that there were about 35,000 accidental deaths per year by the turn of the century. Probably the most horrific example of this was the so-called Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911. It happened at a garment factory in New York City. Uh, the building that housed the garment factory caught on fire. The management had not bothered to install any sprinklers or any other fire safety precautions. As a matter of fact, they had actually locked the doors to the factory floor room in order to keep workers from going out on break. So when the fire broke out, most of the workers were trapped inside, and about 146 of them died, most of them young women. So there's huge problems associated with industrialization. And lastly, there's problems associated with immigration, mainly stemming from the response of native-born Americans to the immigrants. A lot of this had to do with the prevailing racist attitudes among native-born Americans. Many of them felt that the new immigrants, particularly those from Southern and Eastern Europe, were stupid, ignorant, lazy, superstitious, prone to drunkenness and criminal behavior, and so on. Also, a lot of native-born Americans were Protestant, and many of the new immigrants were Catholic. Most of them were Catholic, in fact, while a good many were Jewish, or they were people of no religion, which of course caused a lot of strife between native-born Americans and the immigrants. So there's a lot of tensions, a lot of social conflict created by all of these changes that are going on in American society. In the face of all these problems, there were some groups that vigorously dissented against various features of the new American society. Now, there was never a total critique. No one group criticized every change that was going on in society, but there were particular groups that targeted what they saw as specific inequities or flaws in the new American society. And in this lecture, we're going to focus on three of those groups. And those groups are religious reformers, industrial workers, and also farmers. So, first let's talk about religious reformers. Late 19th century religious reformers were a group of people who felt, for various reasons, that the changing American society included a variety of changes to America's moral values system that were not positive, that Americans were becoming gradually less moral, less godly. Now, when we're talking about religious reform in the late 19th century, we're really talking about a very diverse movement. I want to emphasize that fact. There's lots of different religious groups and religious denominations that were involved in what we would term religious reform. But broadly speaking, most of the religious reformers of this period shared three major characteristics. First, they were mostly evangelical. Most of the reformers came from various evangelical denominations that were then popular, including your Baptists, your Methodists, some Lutherans, some Pentecostals, and so on. When we talk about American evangelicals, we're talking about a group of people who shared a couple of core beliefs. Three in particular I want you to be aware of. First, they believed in the literal truth of the Bible. They believed that the Bible was the inspired Word of God, and you could trust it, that it presented an accurate picture of God, of God's relationship to His creation. Second, they believed in having a personal conversion experience. They believed in being born again. You are saved by confessing your sins to God and asking Him to transform your life, and then committing your life in service to Him after that fact. And lastly, they believed in evangelism, hence the term evangelical. They believed that Christians should share the gospel with everyone whenever they had the opportunity. So they're very much a missionary group. They're a missionary faith. Um, in addition to being mostly evangelical, most of the religious reformers during this period were urban dwellers. They lived in the cities. Um, and not only urban dwellers, but most of them were urban middle class people. Lots of them were professionals. They were businessmen, doctors, lawyers, bureaucrats, of course, ministers, office workers, and so on. And lastly, they believed in legislating morality. Now, today, it's very popular to say, and you've probably heard this cliche from time to time, it's very popular to say that the government, quote unquote, can't legislate morality. I'm sure you've all heard that. Well, the religious reformers of this period believed very much that you could and should legislate morality. Not only that, but they actually believed it was the moral duty of Christians in a democratic society to use government whenever it was possible to make society more righteous. And in this respect, they drew inspiration from the various early 19th century religious reform movements, particularly the abolitionist movement. They saw the end of slavery as an example of the government legislating morality and doing so successfully. Uh, the late 19th century religious reformers never united around a single reform agenda. Pardon me. Close that. They never united around a single reform agenda. Um, But some of the reforms they advocated included the following things. First off, they believed, most of them supported the temperance movement. Temperance basically means anti-alcohol. This was a broad late 19th century movement to ban the sale and consumption of alcohol. It had actually gotten started, the temperance movement had got started before the Civil War, but it really picked up in the years following the Civil War. This movement tended to be spearheaded mostly by female activists, women like Frances Willard, who in 1873 founded the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was an organization dedicated to the eradication of alcohol in America. Uh, the temperance movement didn't manage to get a nationwide ban on alcohol until very much later, until the 1920s with the Prohibition period, but they did manage to persuade many state and local governments to begin banning or restricting the sale of alcohol in various ways. If you've ever lived in a city, a town, or a county where the sale of alcohol is restricted on Sundays, or where you can't purchase alcohol after a certain time of the day, after midnight or 1 o'clock, that is usually a legacy of the 19th century temperance movement. A lot of these laws they're often referred to as blue laws today. A lot of these laws were passed during this period. During this period, most states also passed laws outlawing abortion. Typically, the state laws against abortion would ban abortion after what was termed quickening, which is when the baby first begins to kick in the womb. Um, Interestingly enough, support for these laws came not just from evangelical Christians, but also from doctors and from the anti-immigrant crowd, the nativists, those who opposed continued immigration. Why doctors? Well, doctors opposed it because they thought abortion was unsafe. And during this period, the procedures used to terminate a pregnancy were indeed extremely primitive, and many women died from them. Uh, your nativists, your anti-immigrant folks, they were against abortion mainly because they were worried about white native-born American women having abortions, which they feared would reduce the uh, white American population of the country and lead to white Anglo-Saxon Protestants being overwhelmed by immigrants and by other ethnic or racial minorities. Um, there was also a broad movement to ban what was termed obscene or pornographic literature. Um, this is not something that was done nationwide, although there was a law passed by the U.S. Congress during this period called the Comstock Law. This law was passed by Congress in 1873, and it was named after a moral reformer by the name of Anthony Comstock, who founded the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. And this law, the Comstock Law, banned the distribution of so-called obscene materials by the U.S. mail, prevented so-called obscene or pornographic materials from going through, from being delivered by the U.S. Post Office. Um, in addition to banning the distribution of pornography, it also had the effect of banning the mailing of any information concerning contraception or birth control, because these materials were deemed to be too obscene or too uh, controversial to be fit for widespread dissemination. There was also an anti-polygamy movement. The anti-polygamy movement um, focused on eradicating the practice of multiple marriages throughout the United States. Now, most of the anti-polygamy movement was actually directed against one state, and you can probably guess which state that was. If you haven't guessed already, it's Utah. Um, as you're aware from our lecture on the West, on the settlement of the western United States, the modern day state of Utah was founded mostly by members of the Mormon faith. Um, and of course, one of the original tenets of the Mormon faith was the practice of multiple marriages, or polygamy, um, sometimes referred to as bigamy. Congress actually outlawed polygamy with the so-called Anti-Bigamy Act of 1862. This law was not widely enforced, however. Then in 1882, Congress passed another piece of legislation called the Edmunds Act, um, which actually made polygamy a federal felony. Um, and this one they actually attempted to enforce with varying levels of success. Um, Moreover, Congress basically kept Utah out of the Union. One of the upshots of the anti-polygamy movement is that Utah doesn't join the Union until way, way later than it actually could have joined the Union based on its population. Um, Congress basically refuses to admit Utah to the Union as a state until after the Mormons officially banned polygamy. The Mormon Church passed a resolution in 1890 abandoning the practice of polygamy, and 6 years later, Utah was granted statehood. So that's religious reform. Now, next we come to industrial workers. Christians were obviously not the only group that was trying to exert control over the social changes occurring in their society. Another group that was also trying to control or influence those changes was factory workers, industrial workers, people laboring in the giant um, manufacturing and industrial plants that the large corporations like Standard Oil and U.S. Steel and Swift and Armor and all of those companies were creating. Industrial workers as a group, they had benefited from some of the opportunities that the emerging industrial capitalist economy had created. There was certainly lots of jobs available to them, and some of them saw their standard of living improve over this period. But they had also borne the brunt of many of the worst inequities of this system: the long hours, the harsh and dangerous working conditions, and so on. Also, they were the people who were most likely to be negatively affected whenever the economy took a turn for the worse. Of course, as I've already mentioned, there were three major economic recessions that happened during the post-Civil War period: the Panic of 1883, Panic of 1873, Panic of 1883, Panic of 1893. Um, and these were the people who were most likely to get laid off, sometimes very unceremoniously, without very much notice. And so these are probably your most vulnerable people in the new society, at least in economic terms. Um, and as a result, industrial workers tended during this period to begin thinking of themselves as an identifiable group, a constituency, a group of people with common interests. And they began to identify the need for some type of organizational um, institution, some type of institution or organization that would represent their interests versus their corporate employers. Um, and for the most part, what they turned to represent those interests was labor unions. By far the most prominent and the most powerful labor union of this period was the so-called Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor have an interesting backstory. They began as a garment workers union in Philadelphia in 1869. So they begin as a very small local organization for a specific group of people, and they continued to be very small and very local up through the late 1870s. In 1879, however, they elect new leadership, and the new leader of the Knights of Labor was a man by the name of Terence Powderly, who's pictured here. And under Powderly's leadership, the 1880s witnessed a phenomenal growth in the Knights of Labor, in this labor union. It began admitting workers from other industries. It also began expanding its geographical reach to major cities and industrial centers across the country, so that by 1886, this originally relatively small, localized labor union had reached a grand total of 700,000 members, making it by far the largest and most powerful labor union in the country. Why is the Knights of Labor able to grow so dramatically? Its growth is based on a very uh, aggressive but also very compelling message that it put out to the workers, to the industrial workers of the United States. Their message was a straightforward attack on what the Knights of Labor called the powers of aggregated wealth, by which they meant industrialists, bankers, speculators, financiers, and so on. They said that the profits of industry had been unfairly concentrated in the hands of these people, that the profits of industry had not been shared equitably with the workers who actually earned those profits on a day-to-day basis. And that for that reason there desperately needed to be a more equitable distribution of the revenue that America's factories were producing. They demanded many reforms, such as an 8-hour workday. They demanded equal pay for men and women. They demanded an end to child labor. And they also demanded increased worker safety regulations. Um, Now, all of these positions would have been pretty much standard fare among most American labor unions at the time, with the exception of the equal pay for men and women. That was considered to be rather radical. The Knights of Labor also generated a lot of controversy with two other positions that they took, which by the standards of the day were considered to be very extreme. First, they admitted African American workers into their ranks as members. Most other labor unions during this period did not. American factory workers, as was the case with most white Americans at that time, were extremely racist and didn't want to see their unions being contaminated by people whom they considered to be an inferior race. And so most labor unions excluded African American workers. The Knights of Labor didn't, and that made them somewhat exceptional. Second, they also advocated worker-owned factories. They argued that the workers should own the factories and they should elect management to govern or to administer the factories on their behalf. They argued that this would be a better approach than the conventional corporate model. It's not outright socialism, but it's as close as most people are willing to go uh, towards socialism. And many people, many critics of the Knights of Labor did call them closet socialists or communists and so on. The downfall of the Knights of Labor as a nationally powerful union came in the mid 1880s. And there are two events, particularly there are two events in 1886 that contributed to the downfall of this labor union. First, in 1886, the Knights of Labor participated in a couple of large nationwide strikes, including at one point a one-day work stoppage of about 340,000 workers to demand an 8-hour workday. Many Americans thought that this was going too far. They were accustomed to the idea of labor unions striking against particular employers for particular goals or grievances that they might have had against those employers, but they weren't accustomed to the idea of a general strike. They thought that that was too much, and it jeopardized the interests of too many Americans. The second incident that served to undermine the Knights of Labor was the so-called Haymarket Square riot, which happened in May of 1886. And it occurred in Chicago's Haymarket Square. What happened was there was a demonstration, a worker demonstration of approximately 1,500 workers, including some members of the Knights of Labor in Chicago's Haymarket Square. The demonstrators got rowdy, so police moved in to disperse them from the area. And while this is going on, somebody set off a bomb, killing and wounding a couple of policemen. A riot broke out with police fighting demonstrators and demonstrators fighting back, and ultimately 7 policemen and 4 workers died in this riot. The public outcry focused the blame mostly on the Knights of Labor, fairly or unfairly. Most of the blame went to the Knights of Labor, and as a result, their membership took a huge hit. They went from having 700,000 members in 1886 down to just 100,000 members in 1890, and continued to dwindle in size and significance thereafter. So the Knights of Labor in the late 1880s, early 1890s go into a tailspin as a result of the controversies of 1886. With the decline of the Knights of Labor, the organization that filled the void that they left behind was a new labor union called the American Federation of Labor, or AFL. This group was founded in Columbus, Ohio in 1886, just a few months after the Haymarket Square riot. The AFL distinguished itself from the Knights of Labor in 2 important ways. First, it did not support some of the more radical elements of the Knights of Labor platform, such as including worker-owned factories. It also made a habit of only admitting skilled workers to its membership. The thought was that skilled workers would be more reliable, they would be less prone to violence, and they would also be more sympathetic figures in the eyes of the general public, because they would be people who had acquired some type of knowledge or education or training to make themselves more valuable, and therefore they'd be viewed as more respectable, more upper class. The AFL eventually became even bigger than the Knights of Labor had been, topping out at around 1.6 million members in 1904.